Hey, let's talk about commas. In AP style and most media writing, you would not use what's known as the Oxford comma, which is a comma before the and when you're doing a list in a sentence. So the Oxford comma is actually in my incorrect example here. We have carrots, comma, beets, comma, and corn. The comma after beets, the Oxford comma, is really not necessary because the comma in this case is replacing the word and. So if we replace those commas in there with the word and, it would read, we have carrots and beets and corn, period. Now, that's why the Oxford comma is not used in media writing. It's redundant and it takes up space. So the correct way, we have carrots, comma, beets, and corn. Pretty simple. Now, there are times when using the Oxford comma makes things clearer, or using an extra comma makes things clearer. If there is confusion in the sentence, use the Oxford comma, but most of the time, avoid it. So my examples here, he likes eating corn, comma, bread, and butter. That could be read as he likes to eat two things. He likes eating corn and he likes eating bread and butter on the bread. That's a little confusing if he actually likes eating three things. So my second example there, he likes eating corn, comma, bread, comma, and butter. That's the Oxford comma there. And it says, yeah, he likes eating corn, he likes eating bread, and he likes eating butter. The last example, which has no commas at all, reads, he likes eating cornbread and butter. Well, he likes eating cornbread with butter on it. So he likes eating one thing. So, yeah, you can see how a comma definitely changes how a sentence is understood. And it's important. It can save a life if you've seen those memes out there. For example, let's eat, comma, grandma, period, and let's eat grandma, period, mean two different things. First one, you're going to eat with your grandmother. The second one, you're eating your grandmother. So use the comma where appropriate. All right, commas with dates. If a date uses a day and a year, the year is set off by commas. So on the first example, on June 30th, comma, 2020, comma, there was a fire, period. There would be a comma before 2020 and a comma after, offsetting the date. And notice there, I read on June 30th, TH. We don't use TH or ST or RD with numbers in AP style, but it still reads on June 30th, comma, 2020, comma, there was a fire. Now, if you don't use a day date, like in the second example, on June 2020, comma, there was a fire, you wouldn't set up the 2020 with commas. It wouldn't be in June, comma, 2020. June 2020 is setting up the time. So no comma between those two because they modify each other. And the reason why there's a comma after 2020 in this case is because in June 2020 is a clause, and we could put it after the fire. So it could be put, there was a fire in June 2020, period. So that's why the comma's there. Now, if it just read on or in June 30, on June 30th sounds better. So on June 30, comma, there was a fire. Since there's no year there, it is assumed it is the current year. So if you're in the current year and you're putting down a date, you don't have to put the current year offset by commas. Just do the month and the day. Years, the numbers, are one of those exceptions of starting a sentence with numbers. So instead of having to spell out, 2020 was a terrible year. 2020, red 2020, was a terrible year is acceptable. You can start the sentence with a number in that case. It has nothing to do with commas, but I threw it in there. With locations, when you have a city, you usually use the state after the city's name, unless that city stands alone in date lines. 2 weeks ago, we talked about date lines, and there are certain cities, usually really big, popular cities, that stand alone in date lines, like Los Angeles, Chicago, etc. That doesn't need a state name afterward. But if you're going to use a state name, you need to offset the state with commas. So in this case, he lives in Jeffersonville, Indiana, most of the year. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of removing that second comma. So he lives in Jeffersonville, Indiana, most of the year. Excuse me, that's wrong. There has to be a comma after Indiana, because what you're doing is basically splitting it into two sentences. He lives in Jeffersonville and Indiana most of the year if you don't have that second comma. So offset the state name if it doesn't stand alone in a date line with commas. Commas are also used to separate adjectives. So in my first example here, it is a cold, snowy January. It means that it is a cold day and it is a snowy day. So basically the comma there is replacing the word and. It is a cold and snowy January. It's a cold and snowy day. It's a cold, snowy day. The comma replaces the word and. Now, it's a cold January day. It doesn't read right if you put the word and in between. It is a cold and January day, because cold, a temperature cold, is actually describing January. So putting a comma in there, in other words, adding the word and in there, doesn't read right. It's a cold, January day. Is a cold and January day. So cold is actually describing January. You could do warm there too. It is a warm January day. And you're saying, oh, that's unusual for January to be warm. But putting a comma after that, it is a warm, January day, meaning it is a warm and January day. Yeah, it doesn't sound right, and it doesn't convey the correct meaning. Separating out a non-essential clause. So my first example here, my wife, Betty, is quiet. That is correct. The sentence reads fine without the word Betty. My wife is quiet. You're adding a detail, a non-essential clause, a modifier, Betty, and you're offsetting it by commas. My wife, Betty, is quiet. Now, if you put down my wife Betty is quiet, no commas, you are specifying which one of your wives is the quiet one. In this case, Betty. My wife, which one? Betty, is quiet. So by not having commas in there, you may make the person a polygamist. So once again, commas are important. Comma will replace a period when combining two complete sentences. So we ran to the store, and we ate ice cream, period. So there's two sentences there. We ran to the store and we ate ice cream. So the comma after we ran to the store is actually replacing the period. That's where the period would go to end that first sentence. But since we're doing a compound sentence, we ran to the store and we ate ice cream, you would use a comma to replace where the period would naturally go. Now, if we put down, we ran, I know it says ran, but it should be ran. We ran to, well, wait a minute. I'm actually in PowerPoint. I'll change it. We ran to the store and ate ice cream. By not having the comma there and not having the word we on each side, basically what you're doing is you're having a compound predicate. What is the subject of the sentence? We. We ran to the store and we ate ice cream. By removing the second we and removing the comma, you're making the first we be part of both thoughts, running to the store and eating ice cream. And second part of the sentence isn't a complete sentence. We ran to the store. That's a complete sentence. Ate ice cream. Not a complete sentence. You need to refer back to the we, since it's a compound predicate. And you do that by not using a comma and not repeating the subject. So we ran to the store and ate ice cream. One complete throw. Quotes. Where should you use a comma in a quote? Well, most punctuation in quotes go inside the quote, so a comma usually falls inside the quote. So quote, we ran to the store, comma, end quote, she said, period, is how you would punctuate a quote in AP style, media writing style. You usually want to start with the quote. Don't back into a quote by putting she said, comma, quotation mark, and then giving the quote. That's called backing into a quote, burying the quote. You'll hear a lot of other expressions about it. Don't do it. Just start with the quote. So, quote, we ran to the store, comma, end quote, she said, period. Now, she said is perfectly good in journalism. You have noun, she, verb, said, and that's the order it goes to. Think about it if you reverse that. We ran to the store, said she. Doesn't sound right. And that's because you're putting the verb before the noun. And you'll see this when people are not using the pronoun, and they'll have it, quote, we ran to the store, comma, unquote, said, Betty Smith, period. And basically what you're doing is, putting the verb before the noun again, which is not a good sentence structure, and you're doing said she. So think about it that way. And sometimes in journalism, we will use the word said before a person's name, but that usually only happens when the person has like a really long title. So, quote, we ran to the store, comma, end quote, said Ron Allman, professor of journalism and media and coordinator of the journalism and media program at Indiana University Southeast. Since it's such a long title with the name, having this said all the way after that, it doesn't look right. It reads fine, and it is correct. You could do it that way, but that's the only exception is when a person has a long title like that. With a compound sentence, it would be punctuation, thusly. Quote, we ran to the store, comma, end quote. She said, comma, since the sentence goes on, open quote, and, with a lowercase a, we ate ice cream, period, end quote. So the whole quote is, we ran to the store and we ate ice cream. By putting the attribution in the middle there, in between the two parts of the compound sentence, instead of putting a period after we ran to the store, period, quote, we put a comma because it's not the end of the sentence. She said part of the sentence, And since the quote continues on, you wouldn't put the period after said because that ends the sentence, ends the thought. You put a comma there and you complete the quote. So when you do an attribution in the middle of a quote, it's comma, end quote, the attribution, comma, open up the quote again, and then end the quote itself. Sometimes with a partial quote, you'll put quotation marks around the partial quotes. And when you do that, well, one, try not to, but when you do that, there would be no commas. We ran to the store and we ate, quote, ice cream, unquote, and, quote, sandwiches, period, quote. It's almost like you're being sarcastic here. We ran to the store and we ate ice cream and sandwiches, if that's what they really call them. Yeah, it gives a different meaning. I'm sure the person said, ice cream and sandwiches, and you want to attribute those words to the person that actually said them. But doing a partial quote like that, first avoid it. But if you can't, there's no commas with partial quotes. And that is all I have to say about quotes. No, not quotes. I have lots to say about quotes, about commas.